And today we take up the book of Job, which seems somewhat appropriate to the circumstances. So, so I guess if you can each mute yourselves except when you want to speak, that's probably better. As I mentioned when we were discussing Proverbs, Job is not particularly an Israelite book. It's obviously a Yahwistic book. It obviously presupposes a lot of the biblical traditions, but it isn't set in Israel. As a man was in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. Now, the land of Uz, you will probably see in a footnote, is thought to be somewhere in Arabia, but in fact, you might as well say the land of Oz. Nobody really knows where this is. And the real point of it, I think, is just that it's not necessarily anywhere in Israel. And it's typical of the wisdom literature. You're dealing with humanity at large. Now, he was blameless, upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. I read in the last week or two a couple of essays by philosophers of religion on the book of Job, who were arguing that it's about the love of God. You find me a passage in the book of Job that mentions love of God, and I will be impressed. What you'd find in the book of Job, as in all the wisdom literature, is fear of the Lord. Now, that's to be sure reverence, but it's also fear. Love of God really isn't a consideration here. So anyhow, he does everything right. And when the feast days would run their course, Job would send and sanctify his children and rise up in the morning and offer burnt offerings, saying, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their heart." So just in case. So he's playing it safe, doing everything right. And then the heavenly beings come to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also comes among them. And Satan, at this point, is still upstairs, a member of the council of the Lord in good standing. And the Lord says to him, "Have you considered my servant Job, how there's no one like him?" And Satan answered God, the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you put a fence around him?" Now, the implication, of course, is that one should be good for nothing, so to speak. You find this also in Plato's Republic, where he's examining the idea of a righteous person. How would you know whether somebody is really righteous? Well, you have to see that they are not gaining anything by it. So it's disinterested goodness. So the Lord said to Satan, "All that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him." This, mind you, is not terribly comforting. This is how the Lord treats somebody who has been perfectly good and doing everything right. But then Job has one really bad day, in which not only all his property, but also all his family are pretty much wiped out. And Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and said, "Naked came I from out of his womb, naked shall I return. There the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." And then Satan comes back to the Lord. And the Lord says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." And you can mark that little passage. It's an important thing to bear in mind later on when we get down towards the end of the book, that you have right here at the beginning, up front, an admission on the part of the Lord that he has destroyed Job for no reason. Basically on a dare from Satan. And Satan is not impressed. He says, "Skin for skin, all that people have they will give to save their lives, but stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you. to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, very well, he's in your power, only spare his life. And the reason he needs to spare his life is for the sake of the experiment. If he doesn't spare his life, you wouldn't know how Job was reacting to it. So at this point, Job is still holding out. His wife says to him, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. And then his friends arrive. You get the impression, that he was holding up all right until the friends showed up. And when you hear the way they carry on, of course, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. And it's the sight of them sitting there, apparently, that kind of cracks Job eventually and gets him talking. But he does, once he starts talking, it's hard to stop him. In fact, the Hebrew book of Job, it's typical Hebrew poetry in a way, which means it's very repetitive. You tend to say the same thing over and over again. And the Greek is much shorter. And in this case, it seems likely that the Greek translators actually cut some of it because they felt it was superfluous. At the beginning, in chapter 3, he says, let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness, may God above not seek it, and so forth. Now, he may not quite be cursing God, but he comes close. He comes, you might say, as close as he safely can, without actually cursing God or saying anything directly against God. And the friends, pick up on this. So Eliphaz, the first of the friends, joins in chapter 4. If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? Now, you notice here that at the beginning, the friends are all very polite, very considerate, and they will become less and less so as they go along. Think now, says Eliphaz, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. This is the same attitude that we had in the psalm that said, I was young, now I am old, I have never seen the righteous man go hungry. Now, this is also the attitude of Eliphaz. And so he says in 5:17, happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. In other words, what he is saying to Job is, God is actually giving you a great opportunity. He's giving you an opportunity to examine your conscience, find out what have you done that might have brought this on, and given you an opportunity to do something about it, to repent. So Job isn't impressed by that. He says in 6:15, those who withhold kindness from a friend forsake the fear of the Almighty. My companions are treacherous, like a torrent bred, like freshets that pass away. Now, in saying that, I think the implication is they should just sit around and be supportive. They shouldn't be challenging him at all from Job's point of view. In chapter 7, he continues to that human beings have a hard service on earth. Actually, one of the things that makes the book of Job popular as literature is there are several poems in it on how hard human life is. And that's one of them in chapter 7. There's another one in about 14 later on that's just a reflection on the human condition. Bildad weighs in chapter 8. How long then will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Notice already he's becoming a little bit less polite. Does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. Now, this is setting the terms of the debate, if you like. And from the point of view of the Friends, the question is it conceivable that God would do something that isn't right, that isn't fair, that isn't just? And from their point of view, it just isn't. To a great degree, the difference between Job and the Friends is a matter of epistemology. How do you judge what is the case? Do you do it deductively, starting out with certain assumptions about God, and then on the basis of those assumptions, you can reason out what is true and what is not? Or do you do it inductively? Do you look at what's actually happening? And do you judge, on the basis of the evidence that is before you? Bildad is definitely doing it deductively. Can papyrus grow where there is no marsh? Can reeds flourish when there is no water? This is what I talked about in connection with Proverbs, the chain of act and consequence, that nothing happens without a cause. Therefore, Job must have done something. In chapter 9, Job comes back and says, how can a mortal be just before God? Because they've been telling him, to plead his case with God and God will give him justice. And Job isn't buying that. He says, you can't plead your case with God because he is the judge himself. So if you have an accusation against him, what chance do you have? If one wished to contend with him, one couldn't answer him once in 1,000. He is wise in heart, mighty in strength. Who has resisted him and succeeded? So he says in verse 10, I loathe my life. And at this point, you can see the depression is more or less building up. Actually, before that, in chapter 9, verse 20, though I am innocent, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I am blameless, he would prove me perverse. Now, again, keep this one in mind, because it will be relevant again when we get to the end of the book. That Job is predicting at this point that he may have to confess to things that he never did because he is overpowered. In chapter 9, continuing on there, I am blameless. I do not know myself. I loathe my life. Verse 22, it is all one. Therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the eyes of his judges. If it is not he, who then is it? Now, again, bear this one in mind at the end of the book, because this is what Job says about God. I mean, you can very well imagine him looking at the coronavirus. Does the coronavirus distinguish between people who are good and people who are bad? And of course, not. So, says Job, he destroys both the innocent and the wicked. And if it is not he, who is it? This, I think, is one of the great problems of religion. In most of the Hebrew Bible, the assumption is that even if something bad happens, it's Yahweh who must have done it. It's Yahweh who is in charge of everything. Eventually, in the later Second Temple period, they begin to blame more of it on Satan or the devil and develop really a kind of qualified dualism. But that isn't really even an option here for Job. Job's argument is, if this is the way it happens, who's responsible for it? And if not God, then who? In chapter 11, so far, it says, should a multitude of words go unanswered? Should one full of talk be vindicated? Should your babble put others to silence? And now, can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? In effect, saying, what do you know anyway? And he goes on to suggest that really Job is getting a lot less than he deserved, that anyone who goes on talking, from Zophar's point of view, talking impiously, surely deserves what he's getting. In chapter 13, Job responds, look, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty. I desire to argue my case with God. Now, the whole biblical tradition and the whole Jewish tradition really is very argumentative, feisty. You can argue back to God, beginning with Abraham back in the book of Genesis. You have that people are not expected to just submit quietly. And here he goes on, hear now my reasoning in verse 7. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out, or can you deceive him as a person deceives another? Now, this again, I think, goes to the heart of the book, because the friends think it is their duty to speak well of God, to defend God. They see that as their task. It's what we call apologetics, defending the reputation of God. And Job says what you're actually doing is lying for God. What determines what's true and what's a lie? Well, for Job, it's a matter of experience. It's a matter of what is actually happening and how faithfully you represent that. Now, I would put it to you that there are a lot of theologians, certainly a lot of religious people, who habitually lie for God. That is to say, distort the evidence of what's actually happening in order to defend the reputation of God. I think, for example, that has been a big factor in all the cover-ups of sexual abuse in the churches. That people don't want to hurt the reputation of God, that it doesn't seem proper or seemly. Now, says Job, will it be well for you when he seeks you out? So Job is banking on it that God at least appreciates honesty. And we will see what happens with that at the end of the book. Now, by this point in the book, I think nearly all the arguments have been put on the table. And there is a lot of repetition, and this is why the Greek translators felt they could shorten the book a bit. So I'll just pick out a couple of passages here and there in the remainder of the book. One of them is in chapter 19, verses 23 and following. Famous passage. Oh, that my words were written down. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. For I know that my Redeemer lives. This famous passage from Handel. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth, after my skin has been destroyed, then in my flesh, or from my flesh, or without my flesh, is the same one, the preposition min in Hebrew, I will see God. Now, this is a very controversial passage. There is nothing in the book of Job that indicates any expectation of a savior, a redeemer, anything like that. Now, when he says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, what a redeemer is a person, who buys back something. who, for example, you can buy the freedom of a slave. That's to redeem them. Now, in the case of Job, though, who could this be? And there really isn't any great agreement on it. Some people think that he must be postulating that there is some heavenly being who will stand up for him. But you don't actually find that anywhere in the book. So I'm inclined to take it that what it means here is just that I know that I will be vindicated. That it's not so much a statement about who will vindicate him as his confidence that he will be vindicated, that the truth will out. And that's what he's asserting here. Because, as I say, there really isn't anything in the book that would lead you to think that he has any kind of messianic expectation, or indeed that he thinks he has a heavenly advocate. Some people would argue that the Redeemer must be God, actually, because God is the only one with the power to do it. But I think I would leave it more vague than that and just say that he's expressing the confidence that he will, in fact, be vindicated. Now, we'll skip ahead to chapter 28. Chapter 28 is a poem on wisdom that isn't part of the dialogues. You see, the book as a whole is mainly dialogues between Job and his friends. At the beginning and at the end, you have a prose story. Most people, I think, would figure that the prose story was older, that there was a story about a perfectly righteous person named Job. And that what happens, the way the book of Job is composed, is that a poet goes to work on it and inserts those dialogues with the friends and even with God into it and makes it a much more dramatic composition than the original folktale was. This poem in chapter 28 has been compared to a chorus in a Greek drama because it seems to be standing back from the action and commenting on it. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold to be refined. Iron is taken out of the earth, copper is melted from ore, and so forth. And it goes on saying how human beings, are amazing. They can find all sorts of things. They can find things that are hidden in the depths of the earth. But where does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? This is verse 20. It is hidden from the eyes of all the living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. Now, I think what's remarkable about that is that it doesn't say that God created wisdom. It suggests that wisdom is there. There is such a thing. It is somewhere hidden in the structure of the world, in the depths of the world. And the exceptional thing about God is that God alone knows where it is. God knows how to find it. And he said to humankind, truly, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. In other words, God isn't telling human beings how to find wisdom. He's saying for you, wisdom is fear of me. If you want to be wise, you just stay in your place and do what I tell you. Now, this, I think, is the view of the book of Job. It's different from the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs, wisdom calls out. Anybody can respond to it and find it. But not according to Job. We will also find a skeptical view of wisdom in the book of Koheleth next day. But here in Job, definitely, he's not denying that the world makes sense. He is denying that human beings can figure that out. And so the solution is just submit to God, keep your head down and get on with it. In chapters 29 to 31, there are kind of confessions of Job in which he's protesting his own innocence. He says, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old, in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. When I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was still with me, when my children were round about me." Now, he says, I delivered the poor who cried, the orphan who had no helper, the blessing of the wretched came upon me. I put on righteousness and it clothed me. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, a father to the needy. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous. So he is saying he was a thoroughly righteous person, that he did everything that he thought a righteous person should do. Now, then he says, I thought, I shall die in my nest. I shall multiply my days like the phoenix. And this, I think, is what makes this whole passage somewhat ironic. That on the one hand, Job does seem to have been a righteous person, at least tried to be a righteous person, tried to do the right thing. But he also figured that he had a deal with God, and that if he kept up his part of the bargain, then he would multiply his days like a phoenix. And he says, they listened to me and waited. When I spoke, they did not speak again. They waited for me like the rain. In other words, then, this was the appropriate order of things. Job was good, and he was treated accordingly. But now he says, in chapter 30, thou that make sport of me, those who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. And I think this begins to show that Job may have had his weaknesses after all. That he was good, but he knew he was good. He thought he was good, and he may not have been quite as good as he thought he was. You know, that he figures that he has his proper place in the universe, and it's on top of the hierarchy. And that's then what he goes on to suggest, you know, if I did anything wrong, well, it says, if I ever, you know, looked after another woman, then let my wife grind for another. And he kind of prescribes in a way to God in chapter 31 what would have been the appropriate penalties. The irony of it is, of course, that he's in no situation to bargain. And what becomes apparent from all of this is that there is no agreement with God, at least not that God feels bound to. Now, I mean, this is actually fairly radical because most of the Hebrew Bible, most of the Old Testament, is postulated on the idea that God made an agreement with Israel. And that then, if Israel was punished, this would be because they had done something wrong. Now, if you apply that then to individuals, then in effect, he's practically saying here the covenant doesn't work. That the world doesn't work on the basis of a covenantal system. Or at least he's putting that in doubt. In chapters 32 to 36, another friend comes along. And this one is Elihu. A lot of commentators have found that the chapters of Elihu seem to be redundant. He's just going over the same ground. He isn't really adding anything new to the argument. But they were probably added by somebody who was dissatisfied with the case that had been made, and who thought the friends should have been able to put Joel and put Job in his place more effectively than that. And so they give it another shot. But it's very much the same kind of arguments that, in effect, you see, God, far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. Because If you don't believe that God does what is right, well, then what hope is there for any kind of order in the world at all? Finally, in chapter 38, the Lord answers Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? It's a famous question. Tell me if you know its measurements. Who stretched the line upon it? And he goes on asking Job a whole series of impossible questions. Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Who has let the wild ass go free? Now, I think a lot of people might look at this and say, so what? I mean, what does any of this have to do with the basic situation here? Are these relevant questions? You see, in effect, what the Lord is saying to Job is, I've got much bigger things on my mind than you. We all like to think that the world revolves around us. At the very least, we like to think that the world revolves around humanity, that everything exists for the sake of humanity. Now, these poems where God speaks from the whirlwind, I think, are probably the strongest case in the Bible, for environmentalism, for the inherent value of nature, if you like, because what they're saying is that the mountain goats matter to God. Well, it doesn't quite say just as much as humanity, but it doesn't say otherwise either. It says God is responsible for all of creation, and Job shouldn't assume that it's all about him. So Job responds, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and I will not answer. And then God comes back and hits him with a few more chapters, telling him about Behemoth and Leviathan, these mythical monsters, and saying, God has all of these things to worry about. God controls all of this. Who are you to question him? And at the end of it, Job answered, I know that you can do all things, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Now, of course, you remember at this point what he had said back at the beginning, that God would be able to make him confess to things that he hadn't even done. So you've got to take his submission in a way with a grain of salt. At least he knew that this was the probable outcome, that this was pretty much inevitable. But then you switch back to the prose. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your true friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, I imagine Eliphaz must have been bitterly surprised by all of that. Eliphaz, after all, had been taking it upon himself to defend God. And now it turns out God doesn't even appreciate it. He says, you haven't spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, do you remember what they each have said? Eliphaz and his friends said, God does not pervert justice. Job had said, He does. He destroys both the innocent and the guilty. If it is not he, who is it? Now, it seems to me then that what God is saying here at the end is at least Job was honest. He may not have understood the whole picture, but at least he was telling it as he saw it. And then he says, get my servant Job to pray for you, and I will accept his prayer. And so the three friends are more or less humiliated and have to ask Job for help. And then we're told the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then there came to him his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him, and they each gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than the farmer, and gave him a new family, in effect. Gave him much more property than he had ever had, and then new children, and so forth. Now, if you were Job at the end of the book, how would you feel about all of this? When all the brothers and sisters and friends come out of the woodwork, would you not be inclined to wonder, say to them, where have you been when I needed you?
Yeah.
It's only when he is restored, you see, that they suddenly become supportive. Any thoughts on it? So, what will Job have learned from the whole experience? Any takers? You can unmute yourselves at this point.
I was struck by the sentence where it says that of his daughters, Job, as their father, gave his daughters an estate among their brothers.
Yes.
42:15. And one of the thoughts I kind of had was, this whole time we see God as this untamed, just wild, like delighting in the wildness of creation. And it's almost like Job kind of like took on this quality of also just like doing whatever the heck he wanted, like, prescribing less to like what's expected in society, but, overturning some of the rules, or kind of like doing things just for kicks, just the way God does.
Well, maybe it's also, about as near a thing to a feminist statement as you will find in the Old Testament. It's one case, I think, where somebody does something gratuitously to give women equal rights. Whereas in the Pentateuch, they're allowed to inherit when they have no brothers. That's all.
Why do you think they included that sentence? Or
well, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's certainly what you get at the end here is meant to be perceived as better than the way things were at the beginning. So whoever wrote this thought, obviously, that women should have an inheritance. And here was his opportunity to get it in. But now, if you were Job, would you feel, well, it's all right now, I got back more than I lost? Does he get back what he lost?
No.
Oh, because what about all the kids? There is, in a way, no giving back.
Yeah, I think that if someone killed all of your kids and then said it's okay, you can have 7 new ones, I wouldn't be thrilled about that situation. But I also think that for me, when I think about kind of what he gets from all this, is that I think what always kind of strikes me about the scene from the whirlwind is that it's not an explication of God's justice. It's an explication of God's power.
Yeah.
There's this kind of just overwhelming power that basically says you can never understand this. So that I think what it leaves Job with is this kind of just Humility, maybe, but just this kind of just kind of crushing sense of nothingness in the face of the divine. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think humility is fair enough with that. He should certainly end up a humbler person and much less sure of himself. But you see, what this picture of God does, I think, is undercut the idea that there is a correlation between your virtue and how you do in life. And now, I mean, that correlation is very strong, you see, in most of the Hebrew Bible. And it was really a dogma in the book of Proverbs. So the friends of Job, are perfectly orthodox most of the time. Now, what Job is saying is, no, it doesn't actually work that way. Let's see. I think, Martha, did you have a question there?
Dr. Collins, I had a question.
Yes, speak up.
It's me, Gloria. I'm thinking that what if it isn't about, okay, yes, we can talk about God's power, but how about the fact that, you remember last week you were talking about this whole idea of cosmic order? And what if there is no cosmic order? What if we didn't make this about God, but maybe trying to, like you said earlier, like trying to make excuses for God trying to show his power and all this stuff? What if it's just, one day it rains, one day it doesn't, one day we have an earthquake, one day Vesuvius explodes, and that's just what it is. You know what I mean? And somehow we just have to, and there's no sort of recompense that will make it better. No, I shouldn't have gone through that stuff. That stuff sucked. I shouldn't have had boils in my body. But I did, and I survived, and I am going to continue living my best life. So it's interesting how I find, I don't know, I'm not becoming a skeptic or anything, but it just always seems like we're always trying to solve the problem of God throughout the Old Testament,
Yeah, but then the question becomes, what's the relationship between God and the way things are? Because I think you're quite right, that what comes across from the book of Job is, this is just the way it is. Now, there is actually a reason given for why Job is put through all this. It's because Satan taunted God or challenged God. So if you like, it's a dare. But that's obviously, a fictional way of putting it. I think the more basic point is that if a disaster befalls somebody, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have done anything wrong. That there's not that tight a correlation. Now, you see, that then leaves you, I think we all work certainly in the Christian tradition with the idea that God controls everything. Now, perhaps one way of addressing it is to suggest that God doesn't actually control everything. That there is a kind of autonomy in the universe that it follows its own course. But, the great dilemma, I would think, of religion is to maintain simultaneously an omnipotent God and a good God. Because anybody with eyes in their head can see that things don't always work out for the best. There's an awful lot of unmerited suffering in the world with no reason for it that we can see. And that, I think, is really the main argument of the book of Job. That an awful lot of the Old Testament, you see, is trying to find a logic in what happens. The whole system of the covenant is trying to make a logical correlation between what people did and what happened to them. And Job, in a way, is throwing up his hands on that. Now, at the same time, I think it's important that the book ends on a positive note, because it doesn't want you to go away bitter about this. I think it still wants to affirm that on the whole, life is good. The morning stars sing for joy. But the very fact, that the way things are is illustrated in the speech of God by talking about mountain goats and about lions, which after all live by eating other creatures, suggests that there is a kind of chaos factor, that there is a certain element of randomness in creation, and that while, God is good, that doesn't mean that this is going to translate into justice or good things happening to people all along the line. Any other comments or questions?
I have a question, Professor. Is this somehow tied into kind of the beginnings of Genesis in two ways, where initially we're supposed to be the stewards of the earth, and so you have God's response about talking about kind of nailing down what creation is and how we're really not very good stewards of that, and that God is really the ultimate steward. And then the second part is that we're no longer in the garden. That somehow, the reason why the world is as it is because we're no longer in paradise. Does Job presuppose that narrative theologically?
Well, we're no longer in paradise, but I think what I get from the end of the book of Job is that creation and the world are much bigger than anything human beings can manage. So, it's not saying we should be doing a better job of looking after creation. In fact, I think it's kind of suggesting that's beyond us. There are huge aspects of creation over which we have no control and about which we have no knowledge. So, you see, it's putting humanity, it's trying to undo the anthropocentric view of the world. It's suggesting that it isn't all about us, that the whole creation isn't just made for us. Now, people have often complained that Genesis chapter 1 has been bad for the environment because it appoints Adam at the end, to rule the earth. And even though that certainly doesn't mean, that they're free to abuse the earth, but still it gives humanity an awful lot of authority on it. Now, the book of Job, I think, to a great degree, is taking that authority away and saying, look, nature is a lot bigger, and it's not really all about humanity. Those things have their own value in the eyes of God. So, it means then, if it's not all about Job, Job in a way here is collateral damage. A lot of his children definitely are collateral damage. It's in a dispute about how good a person Job is. And they're killed off, incidentally to make that point. But I think this is a view of the world where there are loose ends. There's a certain amount of waste. There's a certain amount of chaos that still goes on. And where it's really not all about humanity, and it's not all set up to give humanity a sense of fulfillment. And I think the book of Job is saying you got to get over it and live with that. Closing thought, anyone? You can read Matt Blake's comment there. It's a good question. Is Job's God a capricious, seemingly uncaring deity who is willing to play with his creatures at the expense of their well-being? I would say the answer is sometimes. This is a possibility. It's not suggesting that he does that all the time. But it's saying, He might, on occasion, and you have no guarantees. And there's not much you can do about it. So, by way of restoring your faith in the order of the universe, we look at the book of Koheleth on Wednesday and see what that does for you. All set? See you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc.